A missing boy was trapped beneath a sealed mine while those in power chose to protect their own reputations instead of his life. The sheriff, the mayor, and a mining executive all worked to delay the rescue, hoping no one would ask the wrong questions. But one veteran and his dog refused to look away and turned a forgotten cry for help into a reckoning. Just wait until you hear the twist that exposed the truth and how justice, against all odds, came roaring back. The first howl came just after midnight, carried on the brittle wind like something caught between a memory and a warning. It rose thin and lonely from the direction of the dry needle mine, 3 sharp echoes curling through the hills above Silver Ridge, then faded into silence so complete it made the dogs in town stop barking. For a few seconds, nothing moved. Then porch lights blinked on, then off again. By morning, people had explanations. They always did. Just the wind, someone muttered at Margie's diner, stirring powdered creamer into day-old coffee. Coyotes, they've been thick this year. Could be an old shaft collapsed. Happens all the time. It's that mine. Creeps me out. Place should have been filled in years ago. But no one called it what it really sounded like. Not out loud. Jack Mercer didn't offer his opinion. He was used to silence. He'd been back home almost 5 years after 20 in the Army, and he still preferred the edges of town, where the noise of people didn't reach so far. His place sat on the outskirts of Silver Ridge, close enough to the tree line to catch the cold air first, and far enough from Main Street that nobody dropped by uninvited. He lived there with Ranger, his service dog and best company, and kept to a rhythm. Up before dawn, walk the perimeter, coffee by 6, work with his hands until the sun dipped low enough to make the mountains look like they were smoldering. Quiet, steady, predictable. But that night, the first week of November, when the ground had just started to harden and the smell of frost hung like smoke, something knocked against that rhythm. Jack had been sitting on the back porch, oiling the hinges on the shed door, when he heard the sound again. Not wind, not coyotes, not bats. A howl, long and strangled, followed by a second, broken in two, like someone had tried to keep quiet and failed. Jack stood without thinking. Ranger did too, ears forward, body tense. The shepherd turned his head toward the ridge and let out a low whine, the kind he reserved for when something wasn't right. Jack's jaw tightened. He'd heard sounds like that before, in valleys that had no names, in tunnels cut into foreign stone, in the dead hours when the radio went quiet and someone's voice came through the dark anyway. Back then, he'd been trained to move toward it, not analyze, not hesitate, move. That instinct hadn't faded. By the time the howls came a third time, shorter now, like breath running out, Jack had already slipped on his field jacket and pulled the gear from the back of the truck. Headlamp, rope, IFAC, extra batteries, Ranger's vest, and clipped lead. He didn't make a call. There was no one he trusted to understand without needing the whole story, and stories wasted time. The road to the dry needle mine twisted through deadfall and frostbitten grass, switchbacks lined with rusting signs and half-buried debris from decades of operations long shut down. The county had fenced the place off years ago after a partial cave-in, posted warnings and padlocked the entry. But locals still hiked the area. Teens poked around at night, and people with nowhere else to go sometimes sheltered near the mouth of the mine when winter came early. Jack knew all that. He also knew how easily those people got ignored. At the gate, his truck headlights caught the yellow caution placard nailed crooked above the fence. Unstable timbers, no entry. It flapped lightly in the breeze, the bottom corner peeling upward like it was trying to say something. Ranger jumped down from the passenger seat, his breath steaming in the cold, and padded straight to the fence. He sniffed the metal links, ears flat, then touched his nose to the mesh and let out another low whine, this one longer, sharper. Jack knelt beside him and listened. Silence. Then, far off, barely there, a sound crawled up through the rocks. A rasp, then a whimper, then a high, stretched cry that didn't sound like any animal Jack had ever hunted or tracked. It sounded human, or almost. It made the air around his heart go tight. He clicked on his headlamp. The beam sliced across scrub brush, rusted tailings equipment, and a trail of footprints frozen into the thin layer of frost just past the gate. Fresh, smaller than his boot print, but deep. Someone had come this way, not long ago. Ranger nosed forward, eager but uncertain, the kind of tension that only came when something was truly wrong. Jack understood it, felt it in his chest like a memory. Most people would have turned back, waited, called someone else, maybe convinced themselves they hadn't heard anything at all. But Jack Mercer didn't ignore the sound of someone crying out in the dark, not when he could do something about it. He'd carried 100 rules out of combat, and most of them he'd left behind, but one stayed, stitched into him as deeply as any scar. If you hear the call, you answer. He unclipped the bolt cutters from his pack, stepped up to the gate, and cut the chain in 2 sharp bites of steel. The howl came again. Not wind, not echo, not something imagined. Something alive. Something waiting. And Jack, quiet, steady Jack, did what no one else had the will or the nerve to do. He walked into the dark. Inside the dry needle mine, the air was colder than it had any right to be. It pressed against Jack's face like a soaked cloth, sharp with minerals and age. Each breath fogged white in the beam of his headlamp, drifting like ghosts into the gloom. Behind him, the last trace of daylight was swallowed whole by the earth. Ahead, only blackness. Ranger moved carefully, paws silent on the uneven rock, nose twitching, tail held low but steady. He'd been trained for chaos, but this silence was worse. It didn't hum with tension, it waited. The mine walls seemed to lean in around them, as if listening, as if remembering. The ground beneath their boots was damp in places, caked with a rust-colored dust that clung like ash. Rotten timbers groaned softly as they passed, bristling with old iron nails and half-bent brackets. Decay masquerading as structure. Some beams hung from above like broken ribs, others jutted from the walls like jagged teeth. Jack kept his eyes moving. Minds didn't forgive mistakes. The first howl echoed again, sharper this time, closer. It cut off mid-note, like something had clamped down on it. Ranger froze, ears flicking. He turned his head and looked up at Jack with eyes that didn't need words. They weren't alone. The light from Jack's headlamp caught a glint on the floor ahead, something wet. He slowed, motioned for Ranger to stay, and crouched. His boot had smeared through a slick patch that wasn't water. In the middle of it lay a battered phone case, half buried in the dust. Its screen was cracked like old ice, but still faintly lit, the emergency contact flashing before it flickered and died. Tyler W. Jack's pulse kicked hard in his chest. Tyler Webb, 16. Last seen near the ridge 3 days ago. The flyers were still up at the gas station in the library. Cheap ink on green paper, grainy school photo, a smile that hadn't looked real even before it became a relic. People had whispered, maybe he'd run off, maybe he didn't want to be found. Jack had seen that pattern before, people letting stories fill in what they didn't want to face. But the truth had a habit of bleeding through when you stood still long enough to listen. Ranger sniffed along the drift wall and stopped beside a pair of shallow ruts pressed into the packed earth. Not old mining tracks, not boots, tires, narrow and knobby, dirt bikes. Jack narrowed his eyes. Fresh, not more than a day old. Someone had been here after the mine was supposed to be shut tight. The official story said no entry, too unstable, sealed for safety. But the ground didn't lie. They followed the tire path around a bend where the ceiling dipped low and the walls constricted. Jack ducked under a splintered beam, and that's when he saw her. A husky, mid-sized, white with gray streaks along her flanks, wedged sideways in a collapsed pile of wood and debris. One paw was pinned under a beam, and she trembled hard enough that her collar rang against the stone. Her eyes were ice blue, wild but not feral. She didn't bark, didn't growl, just stared. Ranger approached her slowly, ears forward, tail low. He sniffed once, then again, and gave a soft woof. The husky didn't flinch. Her eyes flicked to Jack. He dropped to his knees and started clearing splinters and debris, working carefully so the pile wouldn't shift further. The dog let out a low, breathy sound that wasn't quite a whine. Her tag jangled against the rock as Jack worked it loose. Echo. It wasn't a stray. It was a someone's. He pried loose the final plank pinning her paw, and Echo bolted forward, limping slightly but otherwise sound. She didn't bolt for the exit. She nudged past Ranger and pressed against Jack's leg, then turned, looked into the dark tunnel ahead, and whined. A sharp, high note, urgent and unmistakable. She wanted him to follow. Jack rose slowly. He didn't need more signs. He already knew what the mind was hiding. The question now was why. Why had someone locked this place down with a living creature still inside? Why had no one come back? They pressed deeper into the shaft, Echo in the lead now, limping but determined. The air grew tighter, the walls pressed closer. Ranger stayed close to Jack's side, every movement careful, deliberate. Then the path narrowed into a secondary drift, a tunnel barely tall enough for Jack to stand in. Across it stretched a newer section of chain-link fencing, secured with a bright silver padlock and fresh zip ties. The edges were clean, the metal shone under the light. The lock was new. But the dust covering it wasn't. Jack stepped closer, brows drawn. There was no posted warning, no signage, no reason for this section to be sealed off separately from the rest. He ran a finger across the chain. The grime clung to his glove like smoke. Then, another howl. Not from the husky this time, not even from the same direction. It came from behind the chain link, farther down, somewhere in the black belly of the shaft beyond. It wasn't sharp this time. It was ragged, wet, human. The sound hit like a bucket of cold water dumped over his spine. Jack didn't move for a moment. His breath froze in his throat. He looked at the lock, then at Ranger. Echo pawed at the mesh, desperate now, eyes fixed on the dark beyond. The realization settled with sickening weight. The mind hadn't just been abandoned. It had been sealed, locked from the outside, while someone was still inside. Not a ghost, not an echo, not a trick of the wind. A living voice, forgotten, buried, waiting. And Jack, heart hammering, jaw clenched, rope already coiled over one shoulder, knew that this was no longer about curiosity or instinct. This was about time, and how little of it might be left. By the time Jack and the two dogs reached the mouth of the mine again, the frost had thickened across the windshield of his truck like a second skin. The late afternoon sun was gone, tucked behind the ridge, and the kind of cold that didn't care about coats had settled into every crevice of the landscape. Two sheriff's trucks were parked just beyond the warning fence, engines idling low, exhaust curling up like smoke signals in the fading light. One of them had emergency lights flashing lazily, not in alarm, but as a message. This is ours now. Sheriff Cal Whitman stood with one boot on the bumper of his vehicle, coffee in one hand, the other tucked in his duty belt. He wore the kind of expression that said he already had the conversation written in his head and didn't expect any lines to change. Next to him, leaning on the passenger side door, was Rick Halford. Gray beard trimmed too neat, windbreaker zipped to the collar, clipboard under one arm like a shield. Halford wasn't law enforcement, but in Silver Ridge, he didn't need a badge to hold sway. As Benton Minerals' safety consultant, he had been behind every closure order, every zoning stall, Every meeting where the word liability had stopped a sentence cold. When Jack stepped out of the darkness with dirt on his jeans, 2 dogs at his heels, and a knot of purpose in his jaw, Whitman didn't waste a second. "Mercer," he called out, not unkind but firm, "you're trespassing on restricted ground." Jack didn't answer right away. He scanned the area. No paramedics, no technical rescue units, no county engineers. Just 2 trucks, a pair of walkie-talkies, and a sheriff who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "That mine will swallow you whole," Whitman continued, sipping his coffee. "If there's noise down there, it's bats or echoes. Nothing worth risking a collapse for. We've got wildlife officers scheduled to do a sweep in the morning." Jack stepped forward, one hand reaching into his pocket. He pulled out the scratch tag he'd found on the husky's collar and held it up so it caught the light. "Wildlife wears ID now?" he said, voice steady. "Tyler Webb, 16 years old, been missing for days. This tag has his name and a number on it. His dog's in there. That means he was too." That cracked something, if only slightly. Halford shifted his weight and cleared his throat before speaking. "Even if, hypothetically, someone was in there, that's a dangerous assumption to act on," he said slowly, as though choosing each word with gloves on. "The ground's unstable. No rescue is worth another fatality. We wait for state crews. Protocol. No exceptions." Jack took a breath. He could feel it, like pressure behind his teeth. That slow, rising tide of anger that didn't flare but built. It wasn't theatrical. It was earned. He looked at Halford, then Whitman, then down at Ranger, who stood still, ears pinned, eyes fixed on the sheriff's boots. Echo pressed close against Jack's leg, letting out a soft whine that barely registered, but carried weight. "Let me ask," Jack said, calmly, "what exactly are you waiting for? A boy is still alive down there, injured, alone. You have 2 dogs that tracked him. You've got evidence in your hand, and your response is wait?" Whitman's coffee cup lowered slightly. "We don't act on assumptions, Jack. We act when it's safe, and right now it isn't." No apology, no urgency, just policy. But Jack understood something else, something unspoken, baked into the frost under their feet. He saw it in the way Halford stayed just behind the sheriff's shoulder, not quite in charge, but not secondary either. He saw it in the way neither of them had so much looked toward the mine entrance since he arrived. Delay wasn't hesitation. It was strategy. Because sealed inside that mine, where Jack had heard real voices and found fresh tracks, was more than a missing boy. There was exposure, blame, and blame in a town like Silver Ridge had political weight. Jack knew that Whitman's department operated on thin grants, some of which came directly from redevelopment incentives tied to the mine being classified as permanently sealed and stable. Halford's company, Benton Minerals, had fought off multiple safety violations over the past 5 years. One more incident, and they'd face full regulatory closure and fines they couldn't weather. And the mayor, Linda Dalton, had staked her re-election campaign on turning the page on Silver Ridge's mining past. Jack's presence, muddy, blunt, undeniable, threatened that entire narrative. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He reached into his jacket, thumbed the side of his phone, and double-checked the screen. A small red light blinked steadily. He'd been streaming audio since the moment he stepped out of the tunnel. Not to the news, not to social media. Just to a private folder, cloud-synced. Evidence. "I'm going in," Jack said, sliding the phone deeper into his coat. "You can call it trespassing if you want, but I won't stand here while a kid dies in the dark because someone's worried about headlines." Whitman stepped forward, jaw tightening. "You cross that line, and I'll cuff you, Mercer." Before Jack could answer, the sheriff's radio crackled to light on his hip. A dispatcher's voice cut through, careless, routine, unaware of who might be listening. "Copy. We're holding the scene per instructions.
Mayor says keep it cold till morning. Doesn't want her kid's name on anything official till they've drafted talking points. The words hit like gravel dumped on concrete. A long silence followed. Even Halford flinched. His jaw worked once, twice, but no sound came out. Ranger let out a single sharp bark. Echo joined with a howl, piercing, aching, real. Across the road, at the edge of the RV park, a handful of residents had gathered, drawn by the trucks, the lights, the waiting. They'd seen Jack arrived. Now they heard the dogs, and one by one, phones came out. Faces changed, from passive curiosity to something harder, focused, suspicious. They'd heard rumors for years, about corners cut, about complaints buried, about officials who looked away when it was easier. But this was no rumor. It was happening right in front of them, and the excuse was wearing a badge. That was the moment things shifted. No yelling, no confrontation, just a collective recognition that something was wrong, and had been wrong for a long time. The crowd started growing, quiet at first, but steady. People from the diner, the general store, the gas station. People who knew Tyler Webb's mother. People who didn't like the way Halford was standing there with his hands behind his back, like this was a PR crisis, not a life on the line. Emotion turned. It had been simmering, but now it ignited. No one said it, but everyone felt it. If Jack hadn't shown up, no one would have gone in. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. And that silence, the kind where the truth hangs naked in the cold, was louder than any siren.
Jack Mercer didn't ask for permission. He didn't argue. He moved. The moment the sheriff hesitated again, that was enough. Jack turned away and began organizing the people who had gathered, pulling together help not from official channels, but from those who knew this ground in their bones. People who hadn't worn a badge in years, but still had strength in their hands and memory in their muscles. He called over 3 retired miners from the RV park, men who'd worked dry needle in its final years before closure, and knew the mine's structure like it was an old friend they didn't always trust. One of them, Hank Dobbs, still kept a personal set of climbing gear just in case, and didn't hesitate when Jack told him what they'd found. Next came Sophia Reyes, a climbing instructor from the local high school. She showed up with a pack already slung over her shoulder, eyes sharp, rope already coiled. No questions, just readiness. Then 2 volunteer firefighters arrived, siblings, Emily and Brian King, who'd heard the radio chatter from their scanner and driven straight from dinner, still in their boots and turnout jackets. Between the 6 of them and Jack, it was enough. He laid out the plan, fast, low voice, no theatrics. We shore what we can, we ladder the winds. Haul system single anchor, figure 8 rigged to a prusik loop for control. Fast in, steady out. No one needed a speech, just a plan that worked. They had it. While the crowd behind the gate grew larger, phones still raised, Sheriff Whitman stood frozen in the middle of his own authority, watching a rescue assemble without his blessing and without his involvement. Jack gave assignments the way he had in the field, not barking orders, but choosing words that had weight. He didn't posture, he pointed, he demonstrated. His voice cut through the cold and was met with nods, not questions. It was leadership born from purpose, not rank. Ranger wore a paracord harness with a messenger loop. Jack clipped one end of the lead to the dog's rig and handed the other to Brian. If we lose voice contact, you tug twice and lock it. Don't let slack build. Echo, smaller and more agile, darted ahead, slipping through narrow passes and climbing over debris with an urgency that never wavered. She didn't need direction. She knew where the boy was. Inside, the mind swallowed them again. This time they moved faster, but not recklessly. Every footfall was placed with care. Every breath filtered through the stillness like a prayer. The timbers above groaned, shifting under years of tension and rot. Dust trickled down with every step, like tiny avalanches of warning. But the team worked in rhythm, placing supports where they could, threading rope through carabiners,
checking anchors and backups with muscle memory and silent signals. Jack led, always forward, always checking. Not fearless, controlled. They reached the chained gate. Someone had already cut through the padlock. It hung open and forgotten, swaying gently like a curtain drawn too late. Beyond it, the tunnel narrowed sharply, angling down into a drift that had partially collapsed. The winds, an old vertical shaft, had blown open like a sinkhole in the rock. A jagged tear led 50, maybe 100 feet down. Debris littered the ledge, but Jack saw footprints in the dust, recent. Ranger stayed behind estranged. Jack clipped into a belay and rappelled first, boots brushing loose stone as he descended. Light bounced off the rock walls like echoes of intent. 30 feet down, he landed on a narrow shelf, just wide enough to crouch. And there, huddled against the stone, was Tyler Webb. 16, pale, his face raw with dehydration, eyes sunken but alert. One leg was bent at a wrong angle, clean break, probably femur or above, and his lips were cracked deep enough to bleed. Next to him sat another boy, older, maybe 18, Hispanic. Dark hair matted with dust, Mason Cruz. He had a jacket pressed to his forearm, soaked through at the elbow. The gash beneath it looked deep but not fatal. Still, he was breathing hard, from pain or exhaustion or both. Tyler turned his head slightly, as if expecting something worse to crawl out of the dark, and blinked at Jack. He didn't speak right away, just swallowed hard. Jack knelt, unclipped his pack, and started checking vitals with practiced calm. "You're all right now," he said, voice even. "We're getting you out." Tyler's voice came dry, broken. His second word, after water, lit the fuse that would detonate the truth. "Chase," he whispered. "Chase Dalton left. Said he'd get his mom. Said he'd come back." Jack paused, just for a second. Enough to register the name. Enough to realize the silence that followed hadn't just been fear. It had been calculated. But he didn't stop to reflect. Not now. Not yet. "Hold still," Jack said. He splinted Tyler's leg with the broken rung of a ladder and wrapped it with a torn triangle bandage from his IFAK. Checked his pupils. Tested for concussion signs. Mason groaned softly as Jack checked the bleeding. The cut was ugly, but clean. Back above, Sophia lowered the main haul rope. The ladder was stabilized with 2 anchors and a tension belay. Every step in the plan was working. But the mine wasn't finished yet. A shift in the wall groaned like a sigh, deep, low. A beam cracked behind them. Dust sprayed downward. A single rock bounced from the ledge above, knocked Jack's light from his collar, and sent it skittering down the shaft. He moved fast, bracing against the wall, arms out to shield the boys. Silence again. Tight, thick. Fear scratched at the edge of every breath. But nothing gave way, not fully. Jack steadied them both, called up with a sharp double knock on the rope, and waited for the answering tug. Then the system engaged, slowly, carefully, Mason first, braced and winched upward, each meter hauled by aching hands and dry rope and absolute focus. Then Tyler, slung in a soft cradle rigged from Sophia's harness, body strapped tight to prevent shock. The prussics bit, the system held, and foot by foot, the boy rose from the dark. At the surface, a hush had fallen. The crowd had groaned, dozens now, neighbors, parents, passers-by who'd stayed. Some with blankets, others with lights, but all with faces hardened, not by cold, but by what they had heard, and seen, and not forgotten. As Tyler came into view, the hush broke. Echo let out a howl, long, drawn from some part of her that hadn't relaxed since her boy vanished. She lunged forward and collapsed beside him, pawing gently at his chest, whining deep and low. Even the hardest faces in the crowd softened. Sheriff Whitman tried one last time. He stepped toward Jack, voice strained. "You drop him, Mercer, and that's on you." Jack's head turned slowly. No anger, just clarity. He held the rope steady and answered with steel in his voice. "What would be on me is leaving him." A beat. "You heard your radio." It was a quiet sentence, but it carried louder than anything else that night. And that was when Silver Ridge, polite, cautious Silver Ridge, stopped being polite. Someone in the crowd shouted. Someone else began filming. A woman called the state police. Another messaged the town council. By the time the last of the rope was coiled and Tyler lay on a stretcher with Echo curled protectively beside him, the story had already left the canyon. What had started as a howl in the dark had become something impossible to ignore, a truth dragged into the light, and a town that finally realized it had been waiting far too long to listen.
The first sound after it was over wasn't a cheer. It was the low, rhythmic thump of a stretcher being loaded into the back of an ambulance. Careful hands, measured movements, the quiet efficiency of people doing something that mattered. Paramedics took Tyler first, still pale, breathing shallow but steady, wrapped in 2 layers of thermal blankets, and Echo curled beside him until the very last second. When they tried to move the dog away, Tyler stirred and mumbled her name, and one of the EMTs looked at Jack and nodded. "Let her ride," he said. "She's earned it." Mason followed, upright and gritting his teeth, one arm slung in gauze. He gave a tired grin to the crowd and said something that no one caught but made Jack chuckle. The edge hadn't dulled. That was a good sign. And then silence again, different this time. Not the kind that comes from fear. The kind that comes when people are trying to process something big and real and unfinished. Jack stood a few feet from the mine entrance, the cold finally cutting through his layers. He'd taken a knee next to Ranger, who trembled from exhaustion, from tension, from something that went deeper than instinct. Jack wrapped an arm around him, pressed his forehead gently to the dog's, and only then realized his own hands were shaking. Relief came slowly, like warmth after a long freeze. Not sudden, not dramatic, just steady and undeniable. In the hours that followed, the pieces started falling into place, some naturally, some because people had finally stopped pretending. Chase Dalton had been with the others when they went dirt biking near the old head frame, despite the fence, despite the warnings. When the ground gave way and Tyler fell, Chase had panicked. He crawled out, scraped and terrified, and ran home. He told his mother, Mayor Linda Dalton. But she didn't call for rescue. She called Sheriff Whitman. And Whitman, understanding what was at stake, not just for Chase, but for the grant funding tied to the officially sealed and stabilized dry needle mine, called Halford. Benton Minerals had everything riding on public silence. A new accident would mean audits, penalties, lawsuits. So Halford made his pitch. They called it a delay, a cautious pause, a wait for qualified teams. It was packaged as prudence, but everyone understood what it really was: fear and control. The motivations didn't absolve them. They explained them, and explaining only made the town angrier. Jack hadn't meant to stream the radio feed. That had been habit, one he'd picked up years ago, overseas. Start the recording when things get strange. If nothing happens, you delete it. If something does, you might need it later. He hadn't needed it. The town had. By midnight, a state investigator arrived, not from the sheriff's office, but from emergency services oversight. Someone had sent them the stream. Someone else had forwarded it to a local journalist. The chain had started, and it wasn't going to be stopped by any more excuses. Sheriff Whitman resigned before the weekend, officially for personal reasons. Unofficially, he was under investigation for obstruction. Halford faced charges for reckless endangerment and was subpoenaed for every report his firm had ever signed off on regarding dry needle. Benton Minerals quietly erased their homepage the next morning. Mayor Dalton stepped down the day after. But it was her son, Chase, who faced the crowd at the town meeting the following week. He stood at the old fire hall podium, pale and red-eyed, and said the thing that needed to be said, even if it hurt. "I ran. I was scared. I thought someone else would help. I was wrong." He didn't cry. He didn't defend. He just said the truth. And that, more than any punishment, changed something in the room. The resolution wasn't clean. It never is. Tyler would walk with a limp after winter. Physical therapy helped, but not completely. Mason's scar faded but never disappeared. And Echo, faithful, fierce Echo, slept beside Tyler every night after they brought her home. She still howled sometimes in her sleep, but the sound was different now. Not fear, not panic, memory. And when the house heard her, someone, his mom, his sister, even Tyler himself, would reach over, lay a hand in her thick fur, and wait for her breathing to slow. That was how healing looked here. Small things done consistently. Not forgetting, but living anyway. In Silver Ridge, people still hear things. The wind whistles through the tailings piles. The timbers of long-forgotten shafts creak in the cold. And sometimes, if you're near the ridge late at night, a sound rises that's almost a howl, but not quite. Something between an echo and a voice. But the town listens now. When a siren wails, they move. When someone cries out, they don't explain it away. They don't wait for a form to be signed or a title to be validated. They keep rope in the back of their trucks, next to the flares and the bottled water and the old winter gloves. Not because they expect a disaster, because they expect to respond. They say it started with one man and his dog, a veteran who heard something everyone else dismissed as wind, and chose to believe it was more. A man who didn't wait for the right time, who didn't ask who was to blame, who moved toward the voice instead of away from it. Jack Mercer doesn't think of himself as a hero. He doesn't say much at all, really. He believes in small words that carry weight. Listen, move, hold. That's how he lives now, walking the ridge each evening with Ranger at his side. Boots crunching over frostbitten grass, eyes scanning the horizon without urgency, only presence. And when the coyotes begin to sing in the distance, he pauses. So does Ranger. Not from fear, from respect. The mind mouths are welded shut now, checked, inspected, double-logged. But the town hasn't forgotten. They remember the night the howls weren't just noise. They remembered when one act of courage pulled a truth out of the dark and made it impossible to ignore. The catharsis doesn't look like celebration. It looks like preparation. It looks like trust rebuilt slowly. It sounds like quiet voices saying, "We're here. We'll answer next time." And maybe that's what strength really is. Not waiting for someone else to move first. Just choosing to listen and then doing something about it.